What you ought to know about a data flow diagram, it's a picture, a weighted diagram, and we're worried about or trying to document the movement of information through processes and then tracking how it gets transformed. Okay, so there's a picture of a data flow diagram, some rules of the game, and we're going to use the game Sarson format. When you look at my video I put out there, when you get started on your data flow diagram, when you're looking for templates, look for GANE, just type G-A-N-E and search. You'll see me in that video do it. There's more than one template, but this is the purest, if you will. It involves processes, data flows, data stores, and sources. Now you might say, well, I thought processes were circles, and I thought data stores were parallel lines. Okay, those are idiosyncrasies. So it's really four symbols that make the thing go. We'll use rounded rectangles, but they won't have the bar in there. Okay. Processes are things that happen, activities. Should be a verb phrase, right? And what a process does is receive input and produce output. It's an action, okay? And so if you've ever got a circle or a rounded rectangle as a process, and it doesn't have to start with the verb or isn't a verb kind of thing, there's something wrong with how you're thinking about documenting what you're doing. So transforms inputs to outputs. You're not limited to have one input and one output. You can have 17 inputs and 15 outputs. But it must have at least one of each. You can't have a black hole. You might know people who are black holes. You give them information, you never get anything out. So a process that has only things coming in, now maybe it's an external entity. If it's a setting, a destination for a bunch of reports, then make it a box. But if it's a process, it needs to have something coming out. It can't be a black hole. It can't be a white hole either. A process can't just invent things. It's driven by something. If it's a place that we're not describing how to create things, then maybe it's an external entity. Sometimes we call those a source of the sink. That those are kinds of internal and external entities. So, might have 2, 1, 3. The numbers don't matter as long as they're each bigger than 1. Processes then can connect with other processes via data flows, right? And these show 1. It could be many. It's great. But they can also connect via data flow to an external entity, also connect via data flow to a data store. Right? So nothing, yes, some syntax. But here's a good question for a quiz. Right? Which of these is legal? And we don't need to know really about what they're documenting. But some of the rules for a process is at least one input, at least one output. Which ones, there's only one that's good, or legal. Yeah, the first one, right, has one input, one output. This one has no inputs, that one has no outputs. So sometimes you can look, you don't even need to know the process to know that they have the syntax wrong, the structure is wrong. There's just something about the thinking. And so the question for this is, well, when you apply the premium, maybe a policy number comes out and maybe a payment amount. Okay, your policy is 873 and you owe us $1,500. So what comes in to get that? Maybe an application for insurance, maybe something, but somebody's got to kick that off. And same thing here. Great, you take in a pay rate, you take in an hour's work, and you're going to calculate a gross pay. You go like gross pay goes somewhere. So it's not just an arbitrary rule to say, gosh, we need to give undergraduates something extra to think about in case they're laying the rules. But just realize, okay, that's what a process does. I'm producing something based on something. Okay, data store is a place that will store information. We calculated something, maybe we need to keep it. We're pulling out later. Kind of like inventory. What inventory does is allow for asynchronous operations, right? Somebody can make my inputs yesterday. I come in and they're available for me to work today, and we don't have to be tied in. So the database is, I calculate the premium amount, and then the person who sends out the bills can send out those bills later. We do not have to be tied together. So it's almost like an inventory or ballast. For a data flow, for a data store, it's always going to be now. Data stores don't do anything, so you'll be getting into, if it's an action, it needs to be in a process. But it's a repository. Data store, too, can't be a black hole. Things go in, things come out. Okay, external entities, right? That's in the boxes here. We're not documenting how a customer decides to order, nor are we documenting what the customer does with the invoice. I can tell that by the box. We are documenting here how we take an order and produce an invoice, because that's a process. So if it's external, somehow they do what they do to give us our stuff or consume our stuff, but it is outside the kind of the boundaries of the system. Sometimes we use the term source and sink. If it's just got arrows in, it's a sink. If it's just got arrows out, it's a source. Okay, and it's an app. Okay, that labels that. The only thing that gets the verb is a process. That is the external. Let's see, and a rule, a syntactical rule, is that the data flow that goes to or comes from an external entity needs to be a process. An external entity can't put anything directly into one of our data stores. It can go through the process of application, we stick it in the data store. That is the thing. Same thing, they can't directly. That's what happened to Target, right? They got somebody to take things out of their data store directly. It would be a security thing. The idea is if somebody gives out a credit card number, there ought to be a process, a whole lot of other things there. And so there are some rules that, so the data flow can connect the process to a process to an external entity, a process to a data store. You can't have an external entity to external entity. If they're talking to each other, well, that's okay, but that's not part of what we're documenting. That's their business. We're going to concentrate on our business, so we don't document that. Talk about coming into the data store. You can't have a data store that goes directly to another store. There's some process that says convert this to that, goes through a process. Okay. So quick, so we'll get to an example shortly. We're going to mostly be concerned here in this class with getting understanding of the context diagram and what's called the level 0 data flow diagram. And the top level, or context, always has one process, key external entities, and data flows. It doesn't have data stores. Those are kind of internal to the process, and we'll look at a picture of, and you've had a couple of pictures in your book, and we'll get to draw a picture of, and we'll get around. The level 0 data flow diagram is really the first time that the process starts getting articulated into its key sub-processes. And so you'll have the same external entities and outside data flows as the context, but you'll break it up into what are the nuggets, what are the steps in getting that done. And if you follow forward with the data flow diagram and technique, there's level 1, level 2, level 3, where each of those processes, if you feel the need, get broken into smaller pieces. And so all this idea is what's called functional decomposition. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you describe a process? Right? This thing, this thing, this thing. You can't kind of just say, how does it work all at once? That's functional decomposition. The idea of balancing is that the inputs at one level match the inputs at the next level. Kind of conservation of the inputs. Oh yeah, how are you going to go about doing it? You start at the top to the bottom, and the answer is yes, right? I'd have some details. So let's kind of look at it, just real quickly, and you have access to this PowerPoint if you want. An example, they got a sales process. The first thing would be, and you'll be doing this for TechCrack 2, identify kind of the entities, who's providing things, who are taking things, identify the key flows of information, the key activities, and then tie the flows to. So this is off on the side. You're going to do a table of attributes and entities. So one of your appendices in Chapter 2. I'm sure after you watch one of those videos, instead of the big watch, he says, let me read that appendix again. But the idea is you have a narrative, right, or some understanding of the process. Then there's a step where you try to make it a little bit more concrete. Okay, this, and sometimes even coming up with the names. What do I call that thing that drives me to write a check? Okay, it's an invoice, it's a request or something. Here's an example then from that narrative and that table of entities and attributes, the context diagram. One process, they have a number at 0. Usually we'll just put the process, external entities, the key data flows, and syntactically, it's correct. Also makes sense that the shipping order goes to the warehouse, the warehouse gets a stack shipping confirmation, status message goes to the customer, and invoice goes to the customer. Customer gives us payment, customer gives us order. So it has some semantic sensibility, but it also is just fine as it stands. The level 0 data flow diagram, following that analysis, says, oh, doing that process that we call here, order system, really consists of what these 5 sub-processes do. And this leveling idea is that if the customer provides an order and gets a status message and gets an invoice and provides a payment, well, that was what we said here, then that's what needs to happen here. Though now it's hooked up to exactly what sub-process handles that. So it's really managed accounts receivable that takes back to the customer the invoice. It's the issue status message process that says, oh, we're working on it, and that comes out of here. So somebody, I'm in charge of this, but I'm not really in charge of that. But it takes it down to a level of detail that says, well, what are the steps? But it's important that the external contacts be the same as you get more detail. In a couple of places that we store the information, so we have our accounts receivable and planning orders, data stores. And the nice thing about the abstraction here, the data store, we might be doing all this data store by writing pencil and paper, storing it in a paper file. It might be an Access database on the desktop. Might be using Microsoft Dynamics AX and Enterprise Resource Planning software to keep those planning orders. The info diagram doesn't try to say, let's get detailed how. This is just kind of talk about the what.